Vesna, thanks for taking time to talk to me today. I have a number of things I'd like to ask you, but first, you obviously have a long career in AML, now financial crime, whatever we're calling it. And I know for me, I fell into it because I've been in it a really long time. For you, I would imagine it had to be a career choice of sorts. So what drew you to this? You've been in banks, you've obviously been an advisor, you've done a lot of great work. What drew you to this part? Give us a sense of how your career path started.
Well, I think we're not, neither of us are doctors or actors who dreamt about being on stage since the age of 4 or something like that. So, to some degree, we all fell into it. I started at Goldman in this space, and we didn't really call it anything like this. We didn't have a name for it. We were doing background of clients, and we got into very serious looking into the background of clients. So we had lists of clients, and we started doing transaction monitoring of clients. This is like pre-2000. And this was Goldman trying to stay away from the kind of, press that in the past they didn't have. Now they're in the press for bad stuff all the time. But that's what they were doing. And then we started calling it reputational risk. And then 9/11 happened, coincided with the new regulator in the UK, single regulator FSA, which is now FCA, and broken in 2,000 pieces again. And so we, grew from that. 9/11 meant that we needed to look into the background of clients a bit more than we did before. And we were the only people at Goldman who did it when all those lists started coming after 9/11 by fax. You remember that? Right. Yeah. With all the caked together names and things to look at. And as they say, the rest is history. And then I started getting involved with this team internally with how do we do this, and going out into the industry, and started writing first industry guidance for the markets business and for the futures and for various other things. And moved banks, met lots of people. Right. Done lots of different things.
Yeah. So, obviously that part is, it's been 20 years. So hard to believe that 9/11 was 20 years, and we'll be doing programming on that later in the year. But after that, it seemed to me that our community expanded its reach, if you will, because right before 9/11, it was, drug trafficking, maybe making sense of a private wealth client to make sure they, get no reputation hit. But now it's human trafficking, it's elder abuse, it's areas in virtual currency. So what have been the major challenges from your perspective, the different roles that you've had, the expansion of what the financial sector needs to worry about, and how they address those challenges?
I think the challenges for us have been that the endless expansion of the topic and the depth to which we have to go. You could say that we also had an increasing number of regulations and requirements, that they have multiplied not only in a certain location, but in countries where they weren't being taken as seriously. You'd think that makes it easier. Well, no, because if you're up here and down here somewhere else, and you need to bring them up, and you're the only one in the industry that's doing that in that location, it's quite tricky. I'm just going to make that quiet. And there's many challenges. Then another challenge is the massive operational impact of all these changes. Right. And of course, financial crime hasn't been the only thing that has been changing. Regulation has been increasing in absolutely every part of banking, along with the importance of data. And as the importance of data grew, the volume of data grew, and then the storage of data. And so that is complex. And then, transformation projects are becoming, everybody is vying for that dollar to make their transformation the most important. So how do you do that? Well, in all honesty, I think that's happening mostly when the regulators come in and beat you up, which is not the happiest way to get to solutions.
Well, let me ask you about that.
Extra hard.
Yeah. So my experience mainly has been U.S. regulators, although I have some experience beyond that. We do hear this from some, I'm not saying you're being a critic, from some that say, well, this is regulation expectations that are changing. And I've said that as much for examiners in the US, because I think sometimes they're looking at a rule and they're being very subjective about how to approach that.
Yeah.
So have you seen a lot of evidence of that outside the U.S.? Because in the US, like I said, I've definitely seen it. So when you mentioned before a jurisdiction that was really easy, my words, and now they've added regulation, that ends up being what catches some of the institutions versus deficiency. So it's not so much a bank or
Yes.
financial institution's deficiency, it's sort of the subjectivity of the oversight.
Well, it is. It's like that everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is that, and I think Wolfsberg has been talking about it recently quite a lot, about the fact that we are sometimes managing risk of the regulator as opposed to preventing financial crime.
Right.
And there is a fire inside of a lot of people who are in this space to actually prevent crime and to do something about, I remember when in one of the banks, we found out that there's a lot of work happens where police will get records from us through courts, of course, and they would be able to trace where somebody is and free up a 13-year-old girl who's been abducted. And really very personal cases like that, where you realize just how much impact on everyday life this work actually has. Basic things like having records, being able to provide them, having people who can deal with that, understand what the questions are, and so on. So I think that it is important that we keep trying to push back into crime prevention, but I also empathize with regulators.
Right.
I think it's been hard for somebody who maybe isn't necessarily inside the bank to perceive just what issues each one of these entities that they monitor has, because they're overseeing so many hundreds, sometimes thousands of entities. Right. And to understand in depth each one, it's very difficult. So they have to have these hammers to some degree, and they have to assume that what's in the regulation is good enough for them to come and investigate. And sometimes they misunderstand, and sometimes, to be honest, we also don't know how to explain, because we're coming from how we see things inside as opposed to how we present. But still, we have rules that are unreasonable, like even requirements for sign off of senior management on every PEP in some cases in the least recent directives, for example. It's adding up to what, not everybody has the bold MLRO and head of FinCrime who's going to say, well, no, in my policy it's going to be like that. And I'm going to talk to the regulator and say why we're doing it like this and why it's not necessary. And we have other controls that are good. Right. So removing admin out of this space is probably, I really, really think it's great that Wolfsberg is taking that on.
Let me shift a little bit. You've been very active in your career with the Wolfsberg Group, which many of us are familiar with. Obviously, the importance of information sharing among large institutions, but also coming up with recommendations, advice, and counsel. Tell us a little bit about the organization and your involvement. Obviously, we're aware of the reports that they issue. They've been useful training tools for many institutions, and having experts like yourself at the table so you folks can come up with, if not solutions, certainly direction on very thorny issues like private banking or correspondent banking, that sort of thing. Tell us a bit about your involvement with Wolfsberg in the past.
I think that's an incredibly useful, beneficial organization. I know that they're going even more professional. In other words, up until recently, it's always been, the second job of lots of different people. Right. And I think they're going to get a secretary who's just going to do that, which will be great. What I found incredibly useful there is something that's maybe less visible externally. Beyond the advice, those regular meetings and contact that's created between different parts of the ecosystem of financial crime is truly invaluable. So government agencies, from those who are writing regulation to those who are, examining, policing, talking about it in the public domain, like politicians themselves. It's really invaluable because everybody's viewpoint is so incredibly different.
Right.
Policemen may assume that because you're a big bank and you have something in the annual report that says you earn trillions, that means that me, the MRO, head of financial crime, have trillions at her, fingertips to press a button and to create whatever they need technologically to gain any kind of data. But just like, us, police also struggle with data, with volume, with time, with the number of people they can employ, what they can afford, training, understanding of subject matters, and so on and so on and so on. I mean, in the early days, it was good enough to understand the regulation and write policies. Then operationally, it became so heavy and demanding. And then, now we're even hiring people who are from super, expert intelligence agencies and deep understanding of certain topics to be able to detect. So you're thinking, what is the bank doing nowadays? Is it policing, or is it, complying with regulation, or is it helping somebody, or is it actually actively being the crime prevention, which maybe wasn't quite the original intention. And I think that line blurring has been somewhat a concern. But then on the other hand, the truth is that everybody does want to do the best they can. So it's an interesting space.
Right. I think Wolfsburg, it's not unique in that our community does like to get together and do roundtables. And I know many meetings. I've been in compliance a long time. The compliance officers would get together. Obviously now AML officers do that. There's, ACAM's chapters. So people do like to benchmark and work with one another. But having the biggest banks basically in the world deal with what you just alluded to, the operational challenges of regulation, which isn't always that well appreciated by our partners, and certainly in law enforcement, but also the regulatory partners don't always get it. So having that voice, I think, is important. And I think to your guys' credit, the Wolfsburg's credit, when they issue something, people stand up and pay attention.
They should, because it's difficult to get it together, because of course there are lots of different people, and there are some people who have spent their lives herding cats doing that, and I take off my hat to them, some good old colleagues, and they'll know who they are. But I think the value to the global community of giving some sense of what's possible, what's unlikely, where to look, is really valuable. And today, for example, it's normal to have standardized lists for sanctions with names in a standard order, and lots of different formats. When we started, there was no such thing. Everybody was doing their own thing. We had people who were sitting there keying it in and figuring out if it's the same thing or not. It took years to get to that. It seems like a really simple thing, switch to another format, but it wasn't. It's about meeting, of the minds, and having an understanding and trusting each other. Trusting that this ecosystem, we are not fighting each other. It's not like the police is fighting the banks. We're both trying to, prevent harm to the society. And that may be still going on, the meeting of minds.
Yeah, that's a great point. So a couple more issues I want to touch on. One is reg technology. So obviously you alluded to it before, and that's operational challenges. Things are not manual. There's such a reliance on sophisticated variations of technology, whether it's machine learning, AI, however you want to define your terms. How do you look at technology, other than obviously it makes you more efficient, hopefully gets rid of in the suspicious activity area, false positive, all that stuff. That's pretty basic. But what do you think is the major benefit of technology beyond becoming more efficient and more focused? What else can it do for our community?
Well, I think, the biggest benefit is that it can detect crime if the data that's provided into it is good enough. and voluminous enough with my, it's not volume, but triangulation, right? With any problem, the more angles you take, the better you can see where the issue is and how to solve it. And so it is with crime. The more items of points of information you have, the clearer it is who is a bad guy, who is not a bad guy, because majority of people are not. And so excluding those who are not guilty of anything from all this difficult stuff is a really vast benefit to normal client base. And then to the society, the other side of the benefit is that you can focus on those who we need to focus on, and powerful products can do that. The issue for, I keep saying us in banks as a former buyer, but the issue for those who are in my old shoes is that there are so many different technologies out there, and it's not always clear who is providing a really good product, how to combine different products. And then of course it's impossible to buy, because you have 10,000 problems and each of them needs 10 ways, 10 bits to solve it. So if you're buying a product for each of the 10 bits, like, I don't know, KYC, you need a workflow, and then you need a client risk assessment, and then you need something that's connected to data aggregation, screening, matching, all that stuff. So it's 1,000 little things that you need for each thing. So buying all those products, it's really hard, to find the funding. And then the other side, the RegTech community, they see the big numbers in the marketing space and so on. But then actually when they spend their years of development on a product that they do as this is what the bank wants, and then they come to a real live bank, and that bank calls every field something else that they planned, and then they need to customize it, and the next bank needs completely different way of doing it, and that one needs another way of doing it. They really struggle. So that is where I think the future is, of how we, the big guys, as in banks, probably not me anymore, but how are they going to be able to absorb this good stuff that's coming out of the RegTech community, and how RegTech is going to cope with the need for customization against something where that they're just too small to do that, but ideas are good. So how do we make it work? That would be an interesting space.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's right. So you joined us as managing director, head of EMEA advisory practice, and I know we're not only excited to have you and have all your expertise, but we also can, partnering at RightSource across the pond, as it were, I think can really help the broader community. What drew you to our organization, and tell us what you'd like to accomplish in terms of both the work, obviously, that you'll be involved in, but also the partnering I'm sure that you'll do with other folks around the company.
So I really wasn't looking to join a consultancy. What I liked about AML RightSource, MRS, is that conceptually it's trying to achieve exactly what you and I have been just talking about in the last half an hour. It's kind of, how do you bring good technology, but also have people who know what they're doing, they're trained. A lot of the time when we used to hire people from outside in big groups to help us with remediations and so on, they wouldn't necessarily always be trained. And we in banks would assume that it's not our problem, but of course it was our problem. And, kind of siloed world of banking and so on, and then other institutions, I don't think it's that different. So I think sometimes the success of these projects wasn't great. And what I like about AMRS is that it's attempting and largely succeeding. When I look at our NPS scores, they're unbelievable, 75 or 69 in some cases. And, global average is 44. For consulting, it's 30. So we're doing something okay, right? That's what I like, is bringing the talent, the industry experience, the training, the thoughtfulness, but also technology through all of that, and then analytics, because analytics is kind of the sister to technology, but isn't a product. So bringing all that together and just focusing on one thing, doing it right, and the financial crime, that's what I really like. And whoever I've spoken to in the company so far, it's been really easy to get things done, which is why it's so successful.
Right. Well, we really appreciate you looking at us as a place to use all the experience that you've had throughout your career. So that's really exciting. And also, as you mentioned, the connection to technology plus understanding of policies and regs. And, I think as we both understand, the vision that Frank Ewing has had since day one is not just that the client comes first, but how can we best work with those clients and give them as much advice and assistance as possible. And I think that results in those scores, right? So I think everybody in the company is embraced that, and they all make us look good. So the folks on these projects throughout the company are certainly making us not only look good, but showing the professionalism that they bring to this, that you've brought to the company. So thanks so much for taking time. Look forward to working with you and many, many future projects.
Thanks so much, John.